Arizona Territory, spring 1872. The blood on Mason Tanner's hands had long since dried, but he could still feel its weight. He crouched beside the stream just outside Tucson, scrubbing his palms raw in the cold water, watching the sunset paint the desert mountains crimson. At 25, he had killed 4 men who had needed killing, the marshal assured him, but 4 ghosts who visited him nonetheless. Mason had learned the hardest lesson of the frontier. Attachment was a luxury that got people buried. His parents, dead from cholera on the wagon train west. His brother, shot in a senseless saloon dispute in Abilene. The girl he'd courted in Texas, married to a shopkeeper before he'd returned from a cattle drive. The West had taught him to keep moving, keep working, and keep his heart as guarded as a strongbox full of gold. Love was a fool's dream in a land where violence and hardship ruled every waking moment. He wanted land of his own, enough cattle to build something lasting, and the solitude to never again feel the knife twist of loss. That was all, that was enough. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made his hand drift to his Colt, old habits. But the rider who emerged from the cottonwoods wasn't looking for trouble. Tom Winters, the rancher who'd hired Mason 2 months back, pulled his sorrel mare to a stop. "Tanner, need you back at the ranch." "Got a situation." Mason dried his hands on his worn denim trousers and stood, his tall, lean frame unfolding with the easy grace of a man who'd spent more time in the saddle than out of it. His light brown hair, still damp from washing, curled slightly beneath the brim of his black hat. What kind of situation? "The kind that involves Apache. Found a woman half dead near the southern fence line. She's been beaten bad. Maria's tending to her, but I figured you should know." Tom's weathered face was grim. Could be trouble coming. Mason felt the familiar tightening in his chest. "Why would that involve me?" "Because she keeps asking for water in English and Apache both, and you're the only one on the ranch who speaks enough Apache to talk to her. Learned it from that scout, didn't you?" He had. 2 years riding with an army patrol had taught him many things, including the language of the people whose land this had been. Mason swung onto his buckskin gelding. "Lead the way." As they rode back to the Winters ranch, Mason tried to push down the instinctive resistance rising in his chest. Getting involved meant complications. Complications meant attachments. Attachments meant pain, but he couldn't refuse to help someone who needed it. That much humanity remained in him, even after all the frontier had taken. The ranch house sprawled low and adobe white against the darkening sky. Maria Winters met them at the door, her plump face creased with worry. She is awake now, very frightened. She will not say what happened. Mason removed his hat as he stepped inside, his eyes needing a moment to adjust to the dim interior. The woman lay on a pallet near the fireplace, covered with a thick wool blanket. When she heard his footsteps, her eyes snapped open, and Mason felt something shift in his chest, like the ground moving beneath him during an earthquake. She couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Her face, despite the bruising that darkened her left cheek and the split in her lower lip, held a striking beauty. Her hair, black as a raven's wing and straight as rainwater, had been cleaned and braided by Maria. Her eyes were dark brown, bright with intelligence and barely contained fear. She wore one of Maria's simple cotton dresses now, pale blue and too large for her slender frame. "I am Mason," he said carefully in Apache, keeping his distance so she wouldn't feel threatened. "You are safe here. No one will harm you." Her eyes widened slightly. "You speak the language of my mother's people." "Some. Enough to help if you'll let me." He crouched down, making himself less imposing. "What is your name?" She hesitated, her gaze darting to Maria, then Tom, then back to Mason. "Naomi, Naomi Valdez." The Spanish surname surprised him, but he didn't let it show. "Who hurt you, Naomi?" Her jaw tightened and she looked away. "Men from Tucson. They found me gathering herbs near the river. They said I was on their land. I told them I meant no harm, but they—" Her voice broke and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself. Mason felt a familiar rage kindle in his gut. He'd seen too much of this. The Apache wars had left wounds on both sides, but women always paid the highest price. "Did they do more than beat you?" "No, I fought. One of them, I think I hurt him badly. They left me for the buzzards." She met his eyes again, and he saw not just fear now, but fierce pride. "I crawled for 2 days before I reached this place." 2 days, Maria gasped behind him. "Dios mío." Mason switched to English. Tom, anyone come around asking about an Apache woman? Not yet, but they might. Then we need to be ready. Mason stood, his mind already working through the problems. Harboring her could bring trouble. The men who'd hurt her might come looking. If she was Apache, her people might come searching for her too. Every instinct he'd honed told him to ride away to avoid this mess. But he looked at Naomi again, at the way she tried to hide her pain, at the defiant tilt of her chin despite her injuries, and something in his carefully constructed walls began to crack. She stays until she's healed, he heard himself say. I'll take responsibility. Tom exchanged a look with Maria, then nodded slowly. Your call, Tanner, but you know what this could mean. I know. What Mason didn't know was that he'd just made the decision that would unravel everything he believed about survival, solitude, and the impossibility of love in a hard land. Over the next 3 days, Mason found himself drawn to the ranch house more than usual. He told himself it was just to check on Naomi's recovery, to make sure no trouble had followed her there. But the truth was more complicated than that. She was stronger than he'd expected. By the second day, she was sitting up, refusing Maria's fussing, insisting on helping with small tasks despite her injuries. By the third day, she was walking the perimeter of the ranch house, testing her limits. Mason watched her from the corral where he was breaking a young Mustang. She moved with a grace that spoke of a life lived outdoors, every gesture economical and purposeful. The bruising on her face had darkened to purple and yellow, but it didn't diminish the striking symmetry of her features. You keep staring at her like that, someone might get the wrong idea, Tom said, leaning against the fence beside him. Just making sure she doesn't overdo it. Mason turned his attention back to the horse. Right, that's why you asked Maria about her 3 times yesterday. Tom's tone was amused but not unkind. It's all right to care, you know. The world hasn't ended yet. Every time I've cared about anything out here, Tom, I've lost it. I'm not interested in another lesson on impermanence. That's a mighty bleak way to live, son. It's the only way I've found that works. Tom was quiet for a moment, then said, She told Maria she has nowhere to go. Her father was Spanish, a trader who died years back. Her mother's people cast her out for being half-white. The Mexican families won't accept her for being half-Apache. She's been living alone, surviving on what she could forage and trade. The information settled heavy in Mason's chest. He knew about being caught between worlds, never quite fitting anywhere. What's Maria thinking? She wants Naomi to stay on, help around the house. We could use the extra hands with spring planting coming, but it's a risk if those men come looking. Let them come, Mason said, surprised by the steel in his own voice. That evening, Mason brought Naomi a plate of beef and beans, finding her sitting outside the ranch house, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. She accepted the food with a quiet thank you, and he settled onto the ground a respectful distance away. In my mother's stories, the stars were spirits of the ancestors, Naomi said after a while. They watch over us, guide us when we are lost. Do you believe that? She was quiet, chewing thoughtfully. I want to. It would be comforting to think someone watches, that we are not entirely alone. You feel alone. Don't you? She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her eyes seemed to hold depths he couldn't fathom. I see it in you, the way you stand apart, even among friends, the way you choose the edges of rooms. You are like me, caught between, belonging nowhere. Mason felt exposed, like she'd seen straight through all his carefully maintained defenses. The frontier doesn't leave much room for belonging. Better to stay independent. That is not the same as being alone. She set down her plate. Independence is a choice, loneliness is a prison. Sounds like Apache wisdom. No, just the wisdom of someone who has lived in that prison too long. She stood, wincing slightly. Thank you for the food, and for speaking your heart honestly, even when you pretend you are only speaking about practical things. She walked inside, leaving Mason sitting in the growing dark, unsettled by how easily she'd read him. No one had gotten that close in years. It should have alarmed him. Instead, he found himself wanting to hear more of what she thought, more of her mother's stories about the stars. He was in trouble, and he knew it. The trouble arrived the following afternoon in the form of 5 riders who came up the main road to the Winters ranch. Mason was shoeing a horse when Tom came to find him, his face grim. They're asking about an Apache woman, claim she stole from them. Mason's jaw tightened. That's a lie. I know it, but there's 5 of them, and the one in front has a deputy's badge. Of course he does. Mason set down the horse's hoof and grabbed his gun belt from the fence post. Keep Naomi inside, don't let her show herself. Mason. I'll handle it. He walked to the front of the house where the 5 men sat their horses. The one with the badge was in his 40s, heavyset, with the florid face of a habitual drinker. The others were younger, harder, the kind who did their talking with their fists. Help you gentlemen. Mason kept his voice level, his hand nowhere near his gun but ready all the same. Deputy Silas Green. We're looking for an Apache woman about 20 years old. She attacked 3 men in Tucson and fled. We tracked her this direction. Attacked them? Mason raised an eyebrow. That's an interesting way to describe it. One of the younger men, a sandy-haired fellow with a healing cut across his knuckles, leaned forward. You calling the deputy a liar? I'm saying I'd like to hear the whole story before I help you find anyone. The whole story is that an Apache bitch knifed my brother when he tried to stop her from trespassing on our claim, the sandy-haired man snarled. She's lucky we didn't shoot her on sight. Right, an unarmed woman gathering herbs was trespassing, so 3 grown men beat her half to death. That about sum it up. Mason's voice was cold as mountain snow. The deputy's eyes narrowed. You seen her or not, Cowboy? Even if I had, I wouldn't turn her over to a lynch mob. Now you listen here, the sandy-haired man started, but the deputy held up a hand. Is Tom Winters harboring a fugitive? Tom appeared on the porch, Maria beside him. There's no fugitive here, deputy, just my ranch hands and my wife. Unless you've got a warrant, I'll ask you to move along. We don't need a warrant for an Apache. You need one for my property. Tom's voice was firm. Now get. The deputy stared at them for a long moment, his gaze moving from Tom to Mason and back. This isn't over. When that woman surfaces, we'll be back. You do that, Mason said quietly, and next time bring a better story. The 5 men wheeled their horses around and rode off in a cloud of dust. Mason watched until they disappeared down the road, his heart hammering. That was foolish, Tom said. You've made enemies. I've had worse. Maria put a hand on his arm. You did the right thing, but she cannot stay here. They will come back, maybe with more men. I know. Mason looked toward the house where he knew Naomi was likely listening at the window. I have an idea, but she's not going to like it. He found her in the kitchen, standing with her back pressed against the wall, her face pale beneath the fading bruises. They will kill me if they find me. They won't find you, not if you come with me. What? I've been planning to head north, stake a claim in New Mexico territory. There's good grazing land up near the Mogollon Rim, far enough from Tucson that those men will never bother looking. You can come with me, help me work the land. Naomi stared at him. You would do this. Leave your position here. I was leaving anyway in a few weeks. We'll just move the timeline up. Even as he said it, Mason wondered at himself. This went against every principle he'd lived by. Don't get involved. Don't take responsibility for others. Stay mobile, stay alone. But looking at Naomi, at the fear and determination warring in her dark eyes, he couldn't walk away. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd been in a prison of his own making. When do we leave? She asked. Tomorrow, before dawn. Tom provided them with 2 horses, supplies, and a warning. It's 3 days hard riding to the Rim country, longer if you're trying to avoid notice. You'll be crossing through Apache territory. If her mother's people find you, they might not listen before they shoot. I'll take the chance. Mason finished strapping down the pack horse. Thanks for everything, Tom. You're a good man, Mason Tanner. Whether you believe it or not, Tom shook his hand firmly. There's a man up near the Rim, name of Jack Cordell, runs a small trading post. Tell him I sent you. He'll help you file your claim. They left before the sun touched the horizon, riding north through the cool darkness. Naomi sat her horse with natural ease, her borrowed clothes more practical now, men's trousers, a loose cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat to shield her face from the sun. For hours they rode in silence, Mason setting a steady pace but stopping frequently to check their back trail. By mid-morning, he was satisfied they weren't being followed. You did not have to do this, Naomi said when they stopped to water the horses at a small stream. I could have found my own way. I know, but I wanted to. The admission surprised him. Besides, I meant what I said. I was planning to move on anyway. You are a poor liar, Mason Tanner. But she smiled as she said it, the first real smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, warming it like sunlight on stone. They made camp that night in a small canyon, sheltered from the wind. Mason built a fire while Naomi unpacked the supplies Maria had prepared. She moved around the camp with quiet efficiency, setting up their bedrolls on opposite sides of the fire. Tell me about this land you want, she said as they ate. Why the Rim country? It's good grazing land, but hard enough that not many people try to settle it. Plenty of water, pine forests, cool even in summer. I rode through there a few years back, felt like a man could build something that would last. And you want that, something lasting. Mason stared into the fire. I used to think I didn't. Seemed like the frontier burned down everything you tried to build. But lately, I've been wondering if maybe the problem wasn't the land. Maybe it was me, never staying long enough to see anything through. What changed? He looked at her across the flames. I don't know yet. But that was another lie, and they both knew it. The second day took them into rougher country. The flat desert gave way to rolling hills dotted with juniper and pinyon pine. The temperature dropped, and Mason was glad he'd packed extra blankets. They were following a narrow trail when Naomi suddenly held up her hand. Mason reined in immediately, his hand dropping to his rifle. What is it? Someone is watching us, her voice was barely above a whisper, in the rocks to the right. Mason scanned the jumbled boulders, seeing nothing. How do you know? I know. A moment later, a man stepped out from behind the rocks. He was Apache, perhaps 40 years old, carrying a Winchester rifle. His face was hard, carved from the same stone as the land itself. He spoke in rapid Apache, and Mason caught only about half of it. Something about trespassing, about the woman, about consequences. Naomi answered, her voice steady despite the rifle pointed at them. The conversation went back and forth, and Mason felt frustration at not being able to follow it all. Finally, Naomi turned to him. His name is Taza. He says we are crossing through land claimed by his band. He wants to know why a white man travels with an Apache woman. Tell him the truth. She did, speaking for several minutes. Mason watched Taza's face, trying to read any shift in his expression. When Naomi finished, there was a long silence. Then Taza lowered his rifle slightly. He said something short and sharp. He says my mother was his cousin. He remembers me as a child, before my father took us away to live with the Spanish. Naomi's voice was tight with emotion. He says if we continue north, we will be safe, but we cannot come back this way. His people have little patience for those who are both and neither. Mason nodded to Taza. Thank you. The Apache warrior looked at Mason for a long moment, then spoke again, his words directed at Naomi. Her eyes widened slightly. He says you are either a fool or a man of honor to protect one who has no people. He hopes for your sake it is the latter. Then Taza was gone, vanishing into the rocks as silently as he had appeared. Naomi sat very still on her horse, staring at the place where her cousin had stood. Mason saw her shoulders shake once, then still. Are you all right? Yes, but her voice was thick. It is only that I thought I had no family left. To know that he remembered me, that he let us pass, she trailed off. Mason moved his horse closer and in a gesture that surprised them both, reached out to squeeze her hand briefly. You're not alone, Naomi. She looked at him, her dark eyes bright with unshed tears. Neither are you. They rode on, but something had shifted between them. The distance Mason had carefully maintained began to feel less like protection and more like cowardice. That night they made camp under a sky so full of stars it looked like spilled salt across black cloth. Naomi stood at the edge of their firelight, staring up at the vast expanse. My mother used to tell me that every person has a star, she said when Mason came to stand beside her. When you find the one you are meant to love, your stars align and you can never truly be lost. Do you believe that? I want to, she turned to face him. Do you believe in destiny, Mason, that some things are meant to be? I believe in choices, he said. We choose who we become, who we let in. And have you chosen to let me in? Or am I just a responsibility you took on? The question hung between them, honest and raw. Mason knew this was a moment that mattered, one of those crossroads that would define what came next. At first, maybe you were just someone who needed help, but now, he reached up and gently pushed a strand of black hair behind her ear, his fingers barely brushing her cheek. Now you're someone I can't imagine riding away from. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing briefly. I am afraid, Mason, everyone I have ever cared for has left me or cast me aside. What if you do the same? What if you do it to me? He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks. I'm terrified, Naomi, but for the first time in years I'm more afraid of walking away than I am of staying. She rose on her toes and kissed him, soft and tentative. Mason pulled her closer, wrapping his arms around her slender frame, feeling her melt against him. The kiss deepened and he tasted salt tears, though he wasn't sure whose. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Naomi rested her forehead against his chest. Under these stars we find each other. Under these stars, he echoed, believing it. They held each other for a long time, the fire crackling behind them, the stars wheeling overhead. For the first time since he'd left Texas, Mason Tanner felt like he was home. They reached the Rim country on the afternoon of the fourth day. The land opened up before them, a high plateau covered in ponderosa pine and mountain meadows, with distant blue peaks on the horizon. A cold, clear stream ran through a valley that looked like something out of a dream. This is it, Mason said, a grin spreading across his face. This is perfect. Naomi's expression mirrored his wonder. It is beautiful. They found Jack Cordell's trading post another hour's ride north. It was a solid log structure with a barn and corral, smoke rising from the chimney. Jack himself was a grizzled man in his 60s, with a salt and pepper beard and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. Tom Winters sent you, he looked from Mason to Naomi and back. That's a good recommendation. What are you looking to do up here? Stake a claim, run some cattle, build a life. Mason put his arm around Naomi's shoulders, a gesture that felt natural now. We're looking for land where we can settle without trouble. Jack studied them both. You know this country doesn't look kindly on mixed couples. You'll face problems. We've faced worse, Naomi said quietly. Jack's weathered face split into a smile. I expect you have. All right, come inside. I'll draw you a map of the unclaimed parcels. There's one in particular about 3 miles south of here that nobody's wanted on account of it being too isolated. Sounds like it might suit you just fine. Over coffee and Maria's cornbread, Jack explained the process of filing a claim and gave them advice on surviving the harsh winters. You'll need to build a cabin before the snow comes. That gives you about 4 months. You'll want to stock up on supplies, lay in firewood. This isn't easy country, but it rewards those who work hard. We will, Mason said. Thank you. One more thing, Jack leaned back in his chair. I run a fair operation here. I don't care about a man's past or who he chooses to love, but there are those who do. Keep your heads down for the first year, build your place strong, and prove you belong here. After that, most folks will leave you be. They spent the night in Jack's barn, then rode out at dawn to see the land. Mason knew the moment they crested the rise and looked down into the valley that this was where they were meant to be. A clear creek ran through the center, lined with cottonwoods. Pine forests covered the slopes on either side. A natural meadow of several acres provided perfect grazing land. What do you think? He asked Naomi. She was silent for a moment, her eyes taking in every detail. Then she smiled, that transforming smile that made his chest tight. I think we should start building. The next 4 months were the hardest work Mason had ever done, and somehow the happiest. They lived in a tent while building a small cabin, working from sunup to sundown. Naomi proved to be as capable as any ranch hand Mason had known, felling trees, hauling logs, and notching them with steady precision. They developed a rhythm, working in companionable silence during the day, talking late into the night by the fire. Mason learned about her childhood split between 2 worlds. She learned about his losses, the walls he'd built to protect himself. You know what I realized, he said one evening as they rested on a log, watching the sunset paint the valley gold and purple. I spent so many years thinking love was a luxury I couldn't afford, but it's not a luxury at all. It's what makes survival worth it. Naomi leaned her head on his shoulder. My mother used to say that love is like water. Without it, even the strongest person withers. Smart woman. She was. I wish you could have known her. Mason kissed the top of her head. I know her through you. By the first frost, they had completed a tight little cabin with a stone fireplace, a barn for the horses, and a smokehouse for preserving meat. Jack had helped them purchase 6 head of cattle and a milk cow, the beginnings of a herd. Mason filed the claim officially, listing Naomi as his wife though they hadn't yet married. It was a fiction to protect her, but one that felt increasingly like truth. On a cold November evening, with the first snow beginning to fall, Mason found Naomi standing outside the cabin, wrapped in a blanket, staring up at the stars. "What are you thinking?" he asked, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her. "I am thinking that I found my star," she said softly. "It aligns with yours." Mason turned her to face him, brushing snowflakes from her hair. "Naomi Valdez, I'm not good with fancy words, but I love you. I want to marry you properly, not just on paper. I want to build this life with you, have children with you, grow old with you. Will you have me?" She laughed, a sound of pure joy. Yes, Mason Tanner, 1,000 times yes. They married that very night in their tiny cabin with Jack Cordell as witness and the howling winter wind as music. Jack had brought a Bible and read the words of the ceremony by firelight. When Mason kissed his bride, he felt the last of his walls crumble into dust. This was what he'd been running from all those years. Not pain, but the possibility of such profound happiness that its loss would destroy him. He'd been a coward, choosing the safety of emptiness over the risk of love. Never again. But their happiness was not destined to remain unchallenged. In the spring, when the snow melted and the meadows burst into bloom, trouble found them. Mason had ridden to Jack's trading post for supplies, leaving Naomi to tend to the garden she'd planted near the cabin. He was loading the pack horse when a rider came galloping up the trail, wild-eyed and breathless. "Jack, there's been a raid on the Holbrook place. 3 men, they burned the barn and ran off the stock." Mason's blood went cold. The Holbrook place was only 5 miles from his own cabin. Did you see who it was? One of them was that deputy from Tucson, Green. He's been telling folks there's an Apache woman living up here, causing trouble. Says he's got a right to bring her in. Mason didn't wait to hear more. He threw himself onto his horse and rode harder than he'd ever ridden, his heart pounding in his throat. They'd had months of peace and he'd foolishly let himself believe it would last. Please let her be safe, please. He saw the smoke before he saw the cabin. Terror gripped him as he rounded the final bend, but the cabin itself stood untouched. It was the barn that burned, flames consuming the structure he'd built with his own hands. Naomi stood in front of the cabin, a rifle leveled at 3 men on horseback. Even from a distance, Mason recognized Deputy Green. The other 2 were strangers, hired guns from the look of them. "Naomi," Mason shouted, drawing his Colt as he raced toward them. Green turned in his saddle. "Well, well. The noble cowboy returns, just in time to watch me arrest his squaw for murder." "Murder?" Mason positioned himself beside Naomi. "What the hell are you talking about?" "That brother of mine that she knifed last year. He died 2 weeks ago, infection got him, that makes her a murderer." "That's a lie and you know it." Mason's voice was deadly calm. "You came here to kill her for making a fool of you. The law's got nothing to do with it." "The law is what I say it is, cowboy." One of the hired guns shifted his weight, his hand moving toward his pistol. Mason saw it and fired without thinking, his shot catching the man in the shoulder. The gun dropped from nerveless fingers as the man howled. Chaos erupted. The second hired gun went for his weapon, but Naomi's rifle cracked and he tumbled from his horse. Green drew his pistol and Mason fired again, the shot going wide as his horse reared. Green's return shot caught Mason high in the left shoulder, spinning him half out of the saddle. Pain exploded through him, white-hot and sickening. "Mason!" Naomi's scream cut through the sound of gunfire. Green was taking aim again, this time at Naomi. Despite the pain, despite the blood pouring down his chest, Mason raised his Colt and fired his remaining shots. The first missed, the second and third took Green in the chest, knocking him backward off his horse. The deputy hit the ground and didn't move. The 2 surviving hired guns, one wounded and one terrified, wheeled their horses and fled, leaving their dead companion behind. Mason slid from his saddle, his legs giving out beneath him. Naomi caught him, lowering him to the ground. No, 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 Mason, stay with me. I'm all right, he managed, though the world was going gray at the edges. Is he dead? Naomi glanced at Green's motionless form. Yes. Good, Mason closed his eyes. Did we just make things better or worse? I do not know, her hands were pressing against his wound, trying to stop the bleeding. But you are not dying, do you hear me? You do not get to leave me. Not planning on it, but the words came out slurred. The next hours were a blur of pain and disconnected moments. He remembered Naomi getting him into the cabin, remembered Jack Cordell's gruff voice, remembered the agony of a knife digging for the bullet. He remembered Naomi's face hovering above his, tears streaming down her cheeks, remembered promising her he'd fight. And he did fight. Through the fever that followed, through the pain that made him cry out in the night, through the weakness that left him helpless as a child. Naomi never left his side, forcing water and broth down his throat, changing his bandages, talking to him in both English and Apache, anchoring him to life. A week after the shooting, Mason woke clear-headed for the first time. Naomi was slumped in a chair beside the bed, asleep from exhaustion. In the wan morning light filtering through the window, she looked thin, worn to the bone. He reached out with his good hand and touched her face. Her eyes opened immediately. You are awake, truly awake. Relief flooded her features. I'm awake. His voice was a rasp. How bad was it? Bad enough, the bullet broke something in your shoulder. Jack says you may not have full use of that arm again. Mason processed this. For a cowboy, a broken shoulder could mean the end of his livelihood. But as he looked at Naomi's face, at the love and fear and relief written there, he realized it didn't matter. He was alive. She was safe. They still had each other. Worth it, he said, you fool, but she was crying, pressing her face against his good shoulder. You could have died. So could you, he stroked her hair with his right hand. That wasn't an option I was willing to consider. Jack rode to the territorial marshal. Green's death has been ruled self-defense. The two men who survived told the truth about what happened. We are clear. Mason felt a weight lift from his chest. It's over then. It is over. They held each other, two survivors who'd found each other against all odds, who'd built something worth fighting for in a hard land. Recovery was slow. Mason's shoulder healed crookedly, leaving him with limited mobility and persistent pain. He had to relearn how to do basic tasks with his right hand dominant, had to accept help with things he'd always done alone. It was humbling, but it was also oddly freeing. One morning in late summer, nearly a year after the shooting, Mason woke to find Naomi standing at the window, her hand resting on her belly. The sun backlit her figure and he saw the distinct swell there. Naomi. She turned and her smile was radiant. I did not want to tell you until I was certain, but yes. We are going to have a child. Mason was out of bed before he'd made a conscious decision, crossing the room to pull her into his arms. A child, their child, the continuation of everything they'd built together. When, he managed. Winter, I think, before the heavy snows. He laughed, the sound startling from his chest. Then we'd better expand the cabin, we'll need more room. Mason, with your shoulder. I can still swing a hammer with my right hand. And we've got time, he cupped her face in his hands. We're going to be parents, Naomi, we're going to have a family. Her eyes filled with tears. I never thought I would have this, a home, a husband, a child. I thought I was meant to walk alone. We both did, but we were wrong, he kissed her softly. We found each other, we found our destiny. Their daughter was born on a cold December night, with Jack's wife Ellen serving as midwife. Mason paced the cabin floor for hours, useless and terrified, until Ellen emerged with a tiny bundle wrapped in a blanket. You have a daughter, she said, placing the baby in his arms. And your wife is asking for you. Mason looked down at the impossibly small face, the shock of black hair, the tiny perfect features. Love, fierce and overwhelming, crashed over him like a flood. Hey there, little one, he whispered. Welcome to the world. Naomi was pale but smiling when he brought the baby to her. She took their daughter and held her close, tears streaming down her face. She is perfect. What should we name her? Star. In my mother's language it is Cowboy, in Spanish Estrella, but I like the English, Star. Star Tanner, Mason tested the name. It's perfect, she's perfect, you're perfect. That night, with his wife and newborn daughter asleep beside him, Mason lay awake watching the moonlight through the window. He thought about the man he'd been just 2 years ago, so certain that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, so convinced that survival meant staying alone. That man had been wrong about everything that mattered. The frontier was harsh, unforgiving, and often cruel, but it was also the place where he'd found Naomi, where they'd built this life together, where their daughter had been born under a sky full of stars. The hardship hadn't defeated them. It had forged them into something stronger. Spring arrived with its usual burst of color and life. Star was 5 months old, a cheerful baby who smiled at everything. Mason had finished the expansion on the cabin, giving them 2 proper bedrooms and a larger living space. Their herd had grown to 20 head, enough to sell some at market and still maintain breeding stock. On a warm April evening, Mason and Naomi sat on the porch they'd built, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Star dozed in Naomi's arms, fed and content. "I have been thinking," Naomi said, "about what we have built here, about how it started." "What about it? Do you remember what you said to me that night under the stars, that you believed in choices, not destiny?" "I remember. Do you still believe that?" Mason considered the question. He looked at his wife, at the daughter who was the image of her, at the cabin and land they'd carved out of the wilderness together. "I believe we made choices that brought us here. But I also believe that sometimes the universe conspires to help people find each other. Maybe both things are true." Under the stars, the cowboy and the Apache woman found their destiny together. Naomi smiled. "That is how I will tell the story to Star when she is old enough to understand. It's a good story. It is our story." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, one by one, in the darkening sky. Mason thought about all the paths he could have taken, all the choices that had led him to this moment. He'd lost so much in his life, but he'd also gained everything that truly mattered. 2 years later, they had a son, whom they named Michael. The cabin expanded again. Their herd grew to 50 head. Jack Cordell became a regular visitor and unofficial grandfather to their children. Other families began settling in the area, drawn by word of good land and honest people. Some of those families looked askance at the mixed marriage, but most came to respect the Tanners. Mason's reputation as a fair dealer and hard worker preceded him. Naomi's skill with herbs and healing made her invaluable to the small community that developed around Jack's trading post. They faced hard winters and dry summers, sickness and setbacks, the usual trials of frontier life, but they faced them together, and that made all the difference. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Mason and Naomi rode out to the meadow where they'd first seen the land, leaving the children with Ellen Cordell for the day. It was early summer, and wildflowers carpeted the grass in waves of purple and gold. 10 years, Naomi said, dismounting and walking to the edge of the creek. "It feels like yesterday and forever at the same time." Mason came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. His shoulder still ached on cold days, but he'd adapted. "Do you have any regrets?" "Not a single one," she leaned back against him, "though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if you had ridden away that day at the Winters Ranch. If you had chosen safety over involvement. I'd probably have a working left shoulder and a miserable, lonely life." He kissed her temple. "Not much of a trade." She turned in his arms. "I love you, Mason Tanner. I loved you when you were a wounded man trying to protect everyone but himself. I loved you when you were building our cabin with stubborn determination. I loved you when you held our babies for the first time. And I will love you when we are old and gray, sitting on that porch, watching our grandchildren play." "That's quite a future you've planned." "It is not a plan, it is a promise." "Then I promise the same." He kissed her long and slow, the way he had that first time under the stars. "You were right, you know, about loneliness being a prison. You set me free, Naomi. You showed me what it means to really live." "We set each other free." They spread a blanket and lay in the meadow, watching clouds drift across the blue sky, talking about everything and nothing. This was what love looked like after 10 years, Mason thought. Not the desperate passion of their early days, though that still flared hot between them, But this comfortable intimacy, this bone-deep knowledge of another person, this certainty that whatever came, they would face it together. As the sun began to set, they mounted their horses to ride home. Home to their children, their land, the life they'd built from nothing but determination and love. "Mason," Naomi said as they rode side by side, "look." She pointed to the sky where the evening star had just appeared, brilliant against the deepening blue. "Our star," he said, "yes. Still aligned, still guiding us home." They rode on, two people who'd found each other in a hard land, who'd chosen each other every day since, who'd built something lasting from the raw materials of courage and hope and love. Under the stars, they had found their destiny, and it was everything they'd never known they needed. The years continued to turn, each one adding new chapters to their story. Star grew into a bright, curious girl who could ride before she could write. Michael was quieter, thoughtful, with his father's steadiness and his mother's insight. Two more children followed, twin boys named Thomas and John. The ranch prospered. Mason proved to have a talent for breeding cattle, developing a strain particularly suited to the high country. Their herd grew to over 200 head. Other ranchers came to him for advice, for breeding stock, for partnership. Naomi became known throughout the territory for her healing skills. She combined her mother's Apache knowledge with practical frontier medicine, saving lives that might otherwise have been lost to infection, fever, or difficult childbirth. Together, they built something larger than themselves, a legacy. A home not just for their family, but for others who needed refuge. When Star turned 16, a young cowboy from Jack's trading post began paying court to her. Mason, remembering his own youth, was alternately protective and amused. Naomi just smiled and told him to trust their daughter's judgment. "She knows her own heart," Naomi said one evening. "Just as I knew mine." "She's too young," Mason grumbled, though he knew he was fighting a losing battle. "I was 20 when we married. She is more mature than I was." "That's different." "Hell?" Mason opened his mouth, then closed it. "It just is." Naomi laughed and kissed his cheek. "You are a good father, even when you are being ridiculous." Star married the young cowboy, James Mitchell, the following spring in a ceremony on the ranch. The whole community turned out, over 100 people celebrating under the pines. Mason walked his daughter down the makeshift aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the terrified, lonely man he'd been before Naomi had entered his life. "She'll be happy," Naomi whispered, taking his hand as they watched the young couple exchange vows. "They love each other the way we do." "I know, it's just hard to let go." "We are not letting go. We are letting her fly," Naomi squeezed his hand. "That is what love does, it gives wings, not cages." Mason looked at his wife, at the silver beginning to thread through her black hair, at the lines of laughter around her eyes. She was as beautiful to him at 40 as she'd been at 20, more so because now he knew every facet of her, every strength and fear and hope. "Have I told you lately that you're the smartest person I know?" "Not since this morning," she smiled. "But I never tire of hearing it." They grew old together just as Naomi had promised. Mason's hair went white, his back stooped from decades of hard work. His left shoulder, which had never healed quite right, stiffened until he could barely lift that arm. But his right remained strong, and more importantly, his heart remained full. Naomi aged with grace, her face weathering like fine leather, her hands gnarled but still skilled at healing. She moved slower but with no less purpose. Their children gave them grandchildren. Star had 4, including a daughter she named Naomi. Michael had 3. The twins, who'd gone into ranching together, produced a combined 6 offspring who ran wild over the ranch every summer. The territory changed around them. Arizona became a state. The Apache Wars ended, leaving scars on both sides. The railroad came, bringing new opportunities and new challenges. Towns grew where there had been only wilderness. Through it all, Mason and Naomi held fast to the land they'd claimed, to the life they'd built. On a warm summer evening in 1902, they sat on their porch as they had countless times before. Mason was 77 now, Naomi 68. Their bodies were failing, but their love remained as vital as ever. "Do you remember that night I asked you to marry me?" Mason said, watching the sun set over the valley, "when it was snowing and we were so young and foolish." "We were not foolish, we were brave." Naomi reached for his hand. "And I remember every moment." "Do you have any regrets, anything you wish you'd done differently?" She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he thought she might have fallen asleep. Then she spoke. I wish I could do it all again, exactly the same. Every joy, every hardship, every moment, because it led me here to you, to this life we made together. Even the parts that hurt. Especially those. They taught us what we were capable of. They showed us that love is not weakness but the greatest strength there is. Mason lifted her hand to his lips. Under the stars, the cowboy and the Apache woman found their destiny together. You remember the story I told Star? It's my favorite story, he smiled at her. Because it's true, every word. They sat in silence as the stars emerged, one by one, in the darkening sky. The same stars that had watched over them that first night, the same stars that had guided them through 3 decades of life together. Look, Naomi whispered, do you see them, our stars still aligned? Mason looked up and saw what she meant, 2 stars bright and close together, shining in the twilight. I see them. We were meant to find each other, Mason. Across all the vastness of this land, through all the pain and loss that could have kept us apart, we were always meant to find each other. I believe that now. I didn't once, but I believe it with everything I am. She leaned her head on his shoulder just as she had so many years ago. Promise me something. Anything. When I am gone. Naomi. Listen. When I am gone, do not grieve too long. Remember the joy. Remember that we had 32 years of happiness that many people never find. Remember that we built something lasting, something that will go on long after we are dust. Mason's throat was tight. How can I not grieve? You're my heart. Then let your heart remember love, not loss. She lifted her head to look at him. I will be waiting for you under the stars. This life or the next, we will find each other again. That is our destiny. He kissed her, tasting salt from both their tears. Under the stars, always. Naomi died peacefully in her sleep 2 weeks later, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. Mason held her hand as she slipped away, feeling as though half of himself departed with her. The grief was crushing, a weight that made breathing difficult, but he remembered his promise. He remembered the joy they'd shared, the life they'd built. He told stories about her to the grandchildren, making sure they knew not just who she was, but what she meant. And every evening he sat on the porch and looked up at their stars, feeling her presence in the cool breeze, hearing her voice in the rustling of the pines. Mason lived another year, tended by his children who couldn't bear to let him go, but he was ready. His body was worn out and his heart longed for the woman he'd loved for more than 3 decades. On a clear autumn night surrounded by family, Mason Tanner closed his eyes for the last time. His final words were simple, I see her, I see our stars. They buried him beside Naomi on the hill overlooking the valley, where the view stretched forever and the stars at night were close enough to touch. The headstone read, Mason Tanner, 1847-1903, and Naomi Valdez Tanner, 1852-1902. Under the stars, they found their destiny together. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations. Starr's daughter, the second Naomi, eventually took over the operation, proving as capable as her namesake grandmother. The Tanner Ranch became a fixture of the territory, known for its fine cattle and finer people. But the true legacy wasn't the land or the cattle or even the family name. It was the story of 2 lonely people who'd found each other in a hard land, who'd chosen each other every day, who'd built something lasting from nothing but courage and hope and love. On clear nights when the stars blazed overhead, family members would sometimes see 2 particularly bright stars, close together, shining steady, and they'd remember the story they'd been told since childhood. Under the stars, the cowboy and the Apache woman found their destiny together. They faced hardship and danger, loss and fear, but they never faced it alone, and in the end, their love proved stronger than everything the frontier could throw at them. It was a good story, it was a true story, and like all the best love stories, it never really ended. It just transformed, living on in the land they'd claimed, in the children they'd raised, in the legacy of love they'd left behind. Under the stars, they had found each other. Under the stars, they would be together forever. That was their destiny. That was their gift to all who came after. Love, in the end, was the only thing that lasted, the only thing worth fighting for. The only thing that made survival worthwhile. Mason and Naomi had learned that lesson well, and they'd taught it to everyone whose lives they touched. Under the stars, they'd found their home. Under the stars, they'd found each other. Under the stars, they'd found everything that truly mattered, and that was enough, more than enough, it was everything.